Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Naval Base cafeteria, the familiar sounds of clattering trays and animated conversations washing over her. After 18 months deployed overseas, the bustling atmosphere of home base felt both comforting and overwhelming. She adjusted her crisp Navy uniform and scanned the room for an empty table, her keen eyes automatically cataloging exits and potential threats, a habit that had kept her alive through 3 combat tours. The cafeteria buzzed with the usual mix of personnel from various military branches. Marines clustered around their preferred corner tables, their boisterous laughter echoing across the room. Army soldiers occupied the center sections, while Air Force personnel gathered near the windows. Navy personnel were scattered throughout, creating an informal but noticeable hierarchy based on rank and specialization. Sarah grabbed a tray and moved through the lunch line, selecting a simple salad and grilled chicken. The cafeteria worker, a cheerful woman in her 50s, smiled warmly as she handed over the plate. "Welcome back, Lieutenant Commander," she said, recognizing the insignia on Sarah's uniform. "Haven't seen you in a while." "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. It's good to be back," Sarah replied, returning the smile. The familiar exchange felt surreal after months of military rations and field kitchens in hostile territory. Finding a small table near the back wall, Sarah settled into her seat and began eating, her attention drifting to the conversations around her. She had learned to blend into her surroundings, a skill that had served her well in special operations. Most people assumed she was just another Navy officer, perhaps working in intelligence or administration. Few suspected her true role within the military's most elite forces. At a nearby table, a group of Navy SEALs had gathered for their lunch break. Their confident postures and easy camaraderie marked them as members of the Special Operations community. Sarah recognized the type immediately. She had worked alongside similar teams countless times, though always in shadows, her presence known only to those with the highest security clearances. The SEALs' conversation gradually grew louder, their voices carrying across the cafeteria as they shared stories from recent training exercises. One particularly vocal member of the group, Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, seemed determined to entertain his teammates with increasingly dramatic tales of their latest mission simulations. Morrison was the type of SEAL who fit the Hollywood stereotype perfectly. Tall, muscular, with the kind of swagger that came from knowing he belonged to an elite brotherhood. His uniform bore the distinctive Naval Special Warfare insignia, and he wore it with obvious pride. He had earned his place through grueling training, but his attitude suggested he believed that achievement made him superior to everyone else in the room. "You should have seen the Navy personnel we were supposed to rescue during yesterday's exercise," Morrison announced to his table, his voice dripping with condescension. Half of them looked like they'd never been in a real combat situation, probably spent their whole careers pushing papers behind desks. His teammates chuckled, though some seemed less enthusiastic about his commentary. Morrison, however, was just getting started. His eyes swept across the cafeteria, taking in the various uniforms and ranks represented throughout the room. "Look around," he continued, gesturing broadly. "Half these people wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real firefight. Especially the women. I mean, I get that we're supposed to be all-inclusive now, but some jobs just aren't meant for everyone." Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth as Morrison's words reached her ears. She had heard similar sentiments before, though usually not voiced so openly in a military cafeteria. Her expression remained neutral, but her training kicked in, every sense becoming more acute as she assessed the situation developing around her. Morrison's voice grew even more confident as he warmed to his subject. "Take officers, for example. Most of them got their rank through college degrees and desk work. They've never had to make split-second decisions with bullets flying overhead. They've never had to carry a wounded teammate through enemy territory or call in airstrikes while under fire." One of his teammates, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Come on, Jake, that's not always true. There are plenty of officers who've seen real action." Morrison waved dismissively. "Maybe a few. But look around this room. How many of these people do you think have actually been in a real combat zone? How many have earned their rank through blood, sweat, and genuine courage, rather than just checking boxes on some career advancement checklist?" Sarah continued eating methodically. though her attention was now fully focused on Morrison's monologue. She could see other diners beginning to notice the SEAL's increasingly loud commentary. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed curious about where his rant might lead. "The problem," Morrison continued, clearly enjoying his audience, "is that people get promoted based on politics rather than performance. They hand out ranks like participation trophies these days. You've got people wearing lieutenant commander insignia who've probably never even seen combat, let alone led troops under fire." Sarah's training had taught her to remain calm under pressure, but she could feel tension building in her shoulders. Morrison's words weren't just ignorant. They were insulting to every service member who had earned their position through dedication and sacrifice. She had seen too many good soldiers, sailors, and officers give their lives in service to tolerate such casual dismissal of their contributions. Morrison stood up from his table, apparently deciding to expand his audience beyond his immediate teammates. His voice carried clearly across the now quieter cafeteria as other conversations began to fade. "You know what really gets me?" he announced to the room in general. "These high-ranking officers who act like they're better than everyone else, but they've never actually proven themselves where it matters. They sit in air-conditioned offices, making decisions about missions they'll never have to carry out themselves." Several diners had stopped eating entirely now, their attention drawn to the SEAL's impromptu speech. Sarah noticed that most of the military personnel in the room looked embarrassed by Morrison's behavior, but none seemed willing to challenge him directly. His SEAL status gave him a certain immunity from confrontation, even when his conduct was clearly inappropriate. Morrison's eyes swept across the room again, and this time they landed directly on Sarah. She met his gaze steadily, her expression remaining neutral despite the storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface. To Morrison, she was exactly the type of officer he had been criticizing. High rank, professional appearance, and no obvious indicators of combat experience. "Perfect example right there," Morrison said, pointing directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant Commander insignia, probably never left the continental United States except for maybe some cushy assignment in Germany or Japan. Bet she's never had to make a life-or-death decision that actually mattered." The cafeteria had gone nearly silent now. All attention focused on the confrontation developing between the cocky SEAL and the quietly sitting Navy officer. Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would respond to Morrison's challenge. She set down her fork deliberately and looked up at Morrison with the same calm expression she had worn while coordinating airstrikes in Afghanistan. "Is there something specific you'd like to know about my service record, petty officer?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. Morrison grinned, apparently interpreting her calm response as weakness. "Just making an observation, ma'am. No offense intended. It's just that some of us have actually been out there doing the real work while others have been climbing the career ladder from behind a desk." Sarah nodded thoughtfully, as if considering his words carefully. Around the room, other military personnel watched with growing interest. They could sense that something significant was about to happen, though none of them could have predicted exactly what form it would take. "I see," Sarah replied. "And you believe that my rank is undeserved because I don't look like what you consider a real warrior?" Morrison's confidence seemed to grow with each exchange. "Well, no disrespect intended, but yeah, some people earn their rank through actual combat experience, and others just check the right boxes on their OER." Sarah stood slowly, her movements fluid and controlled. Even this simple action seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. There was something about her bearing, the way she carried herself, that suggested Morrison might have seriously misjudged his target. "That's an interesting perspective," Sarah said, her tone remaining conversational despite the tension crackling through the air. "I'm curious about your definition of real combat experience. What criteria do you use to determine whether someone has truly earned their position?" Morrison, apparently oblivious to the shift in mood around him, pressed forward. "It's pretty simple. Have you ever been shot at? Have you ever had to kill someone to protect your teammates? Have you ever called in close air support while taking enemy fire? Have you ever led troops through actual combat operations where failure meant people died?" Sarah's slight smile was almost imperceptible, but several of the more observant diners caught it. It was the kind of expression that suggested Morrison was about to learn something very important about making assumptions. "Those are excellent questions," Sarah replied. Very specific. Almost as if you've given this subject considerable thought. Morrison's chest swelled with pride as he interpreted Sarah's response as validation of his expertise. He turned slightly to include his teammates in the conversation, clearly expecting their support for his position. Exactly, Morrison continued. These are the questions that separate the real warriors from the desk jockeys. I've been through Hell Week, survived Bud's training, completed multiple deployments in hostile territory. I've earned the right to call myself a warrior. Sarah nodded again, her expression remaining thoughtful. Your training and deployments are certainly impressive. The SEAL community has a well-deserved reputation for excellence. Morrison preened at what he perceived as acknowledgement of his superior status. Right. And that's why it's frustrating to see people with higher ranks who haven't paid the same price. The military is supposed to be a meritocracy, but sometimes politics gets in the way of recognizing real achievement. Around the cafeteria, the tension continued to build. Other military personnel could sense that Morrison was walking into some kind of trap, but they couldn't see exactly how it would spring. Sarah's calm demeanor was beginning to feel less like passive acceptance and more like the controlled stillness of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez tried once more to defuse the situation. Jake, maybe we should just finish eating and get back to training. Morrison waved him off. No, this is important. We need to have honest conversations about standards and qualifications. Too many people hide behind political correctness instead of addressing real issues. Sarah took a small step forward, closing the distance between herself and Morrison slightly. To a casual observer, it might have seemed like a minor adjustment in position. To anyone with military training, it was clear that she was establishing a more authoritative presence. You mentioned calling in close air support under fire, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of professional interest. That's a complex skill set. How many times have you had to coordinate with fast movers while maintaining tactical awareness of your immediate situation? Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. The question was more specific than he had expected, and the technical terminology suggested that Sarah might have more knowledge about combat operations than her appearance had suggested. Well, I mean, we train for that kind of situation, Morrison replied, his voice losing some of its earlier bravado. SEAL teams work closely with air support in various scenarios. Training is essential, Sarah agreed, but actual implementation can be quite different. The first time you have to guide an F-18 onto a target, while enemy rounds are impacting around your position. The stress can affect radio discipline and target identification procedures. Morrison blinked, clearly surprised by the specificity of Sarah's knowledge. Several of his teammates were now looking between the two officers with growing interest, beginning to suspect that their colleague might have picked the wrong target for his demonstration. Yeah, well, that's why we train so hard, Morrison said, his tone becoming more defensive. SEALs are prepared for high-stress situations. Sarah smiled more broadly now, and there was something in her expression that made Morrison take an involuntary step backward. Preparation is crucial, she agreed, though sometimes the real thing presents challenges that no amount of training can fully simulate. Like what? Morrison asked, though he seemed less eager for the answer than he had been for her previous responses. Like coordinating a helicopter extraction for wounded personnel while simultaneously directing artillery fire and maintaining communication with multiple ground units, Sarah replied matter-of-factly, or like spending 6 hours pinned down in a compound while calling in danger-close airstrikes every 20 minutes to keep enemy forces from overrunning your position. Morrison's face was beginning to pale as Sarah's responses became increasingly detailed and specific. These weren't theoretical scenarios or training exercises. They sounded like actual experiences described by someone who had lived through them, or like having to make the decision to call in a missile strike on a building where you know civilians might be present, because enemy snipers are using it to target a school full of children, Sarah continued, her voice remaining calm despite the gravity of what she was describing. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their activities to listen to the conversation unfolding in their dining room. Morrison's teammates were staring at Sarah with growing respect and dawning realization. Those are pretty specific examples, Morrison said weakly. Yes, they are, Sarah replied. Would you like to know why they're so specific? Morrison didn't answer. but his expression suggested he was beginning to understand that he had made a serious error in judgment. Sarah reached into her breast pocket and withdrew a small leather folder. She opened it carefully and held it so that Morrison and his nearby teammates could see the contents. Inside were several medals and ribbons, but more importantly, there was an identification card that made Morrison's eyes go wide. "My name is Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. "I'm a member of DevGru, what you might know as SEAL Team 6. Morrison's face went white as the implications of her revelation sank in. DevGru was the most elite unit within the already elite SEAL community. Its members were selected from among the best SEALs and underwent additional training that made buds look like basic training. "I've completed 4 combat deployments in Afghanistan and 2 in Iraq," Sarah continued. "I've led joint special operations missions involving multiple NATO forces. I've been awarded the Silver Star, 2 Bronze Stars with V device for valor, and the Purple Heart." Morrison seemed to be struggling to process what he was hearing. The woman he had dismissed as a desk jockey was not only a fellow SEAL, but a member of the most elite unit in the special operations community. "During my last deployment, I spent 3 months embedded with Delta Force conducting targeted raids against high-value targets in the tribal regions along the Pakistani border," Sarah continued. "I've called in more close air support missions than most pilots will fly in their entire careers." Rodriguez and the other SEALs at Morrison's table were now staring at Sarah with undisguised admiration. They understood better than anyone else in the room just how extraordinary her achievements were. Women had only recently been allowed into combat roles, and the idea of a female DEVGRU operator was almost unprecedented. "I've served as team leader on 17 direct action missions, including the operation that eliminated the Taliban commander responsible for the bombing of Forward Operating Base Chapman," Sarah said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone recounting facts rather than boasting. Morrison opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had spent the last 20 minutes lecturing one of the most decorated special operations soldiers in the military about what it meant to be a real warrior. "I've also completed Army Ranger School, Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training, and Air Force Survival, Evasion, Resistance, and Escape Training," Sarah continued. "Not because these were required for my position, but because I believe in being prepared for any mission my country might ask me to undertake." The silence in the cafeteria was deafening. Every person present was beginning to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the revelation of Sarah's identity, but the complete dismantling of Morrison's assumptions about military service and gender roles. "But you know what I consider my greatest achievement?" Sarah asked, finally allowing a note of emotion to enter her voice. Morrison shook his head mutely. "Coming home alive, along with every member of my team, from every single mission I've ever led. Because at the end of the day, that's what real leadership is about, bringing your people home." Morrison's teammates were now looking at him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright anger. His behavior had not only been inappropriate, but it had insulted one of the most accomplished operators in the Special Forces community. Sarah folded her identification back into its leather case and returned it to her pocket. "Now, Petty Officer Morrison, would you like to reconsider your assessment of my qualifications for the rank I hold?" Morrison's mouth opened and closed several times, but he seemed incapable of forming coherent words. The confident swagger that had defined his personality just minutes earlier had completely evaporated. I didn't know," Morrison finally managed to stammer. "No, you didn't," Sarah agreed, "and that's exactly the point." Sarah took another step forward, her presence now commanding the entire cafeteria's attention. Morrison had shrunk visibly, his earlier confidence replaced by the dawning realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation. "The point, Petty Officer Morrison, is that making assumptions about someone's capabilities based on their appearance or gender is not only unprofessional, it's dangerous," Sarah said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through actions rather than bravado. "In our line of work, that kind of thinking can get people killed." Rodriguez and the other SEALs at Morrison's table were nodding in agreement, clearly understanding the deeper implications of what Sarah was saying. In special operations, Unit cohesion and mutual respect were literally matters of life and death. I've worked alongside operators from every branch of the military, Sarah continued. Marines, Army Rangers, Delta Force, Air Force Pararescue, and yes, Navy SEALs. Some of the most capable warriors I've ever known were people you might never suspect based on first impressions. Morrison seemed to be struggling with how to respond. An apology seemed inadequate given the magnitude of his error, but continuing to defend his position would only make things worse. I once served with a Marine gunnery sergeant who looked like he belonged in an accounting office rather than a battlefield, Sarah said, her tone becoming more conversational as she began to share a story. He was quiet, bookish, wore thick glasses that made him look like a stereotype of a desk jockey. Some of the younger Marines in the unit initially questioned whether he belonged on combat missions. The cafeteria remained completely silent as Sarah continued her narrative. Even the kitchen staff had stopped working to listen. During our third week in country, our convoy was ambushed in a narrow valley. 3 vehicles were disabled, multiple casualties, enemy fire coming from elevated positions on both sides of the road. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Morrison and his teammates were hanging on every word, as were the other military personnel throughout the cafeteria. Sarah's calm, matter-of-fact delivery made her story even more compelling. That quiet Marine gunnery sergeant took charge of the tactical situation while I coordinated air support. He organized the defense, directed medical care for the wounded, and maintained unit morale during 6 hours of intermittent contact with enemy forces. Sarah paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. When the rescue force finally reached our position, that supposedly bookish Marine had single-handedly prevented what could have been a catastrophic loss of American lives. He received the Navy Cross for his actions that day, and I learned a valuable lesson about the danger of judging people based on appearances. Morrison was staring at the floor now, clearly understanding that Sarah's story was directly relevant to his own behavior. His teammates looked equally sobered by the implications. The military is not a place for prejudice or assumptions, Sarah continued. Every person wearing this uniform has volunteered to serve their country, and every person has the potential to surprise you with their courage, competence, and commitment. She gestured around the cafeteria, taking in all the different uniforms and ranks represented throughout the room. Look around this room again, Petty Officer Morrison. Really look. That Army specialist over there might have saved his entire unit during a firefight in Mosul. That Air Force captain might have flown supply missions into hostile landing zones under enemy fire. That Navy ensign might have served on a destroyer that conducted combat operations in the Persian Gulf. Morrison reluctantly raised his eyes and followed Sarah's gaze around the room. The other military personnel were watching him with expressions ranging from disappointment to barely contained anger. The truth is, you have no idea what any of these people have accomplished or sacrificed in service to their country, Sarah said. And making public pronouncements about their qualifications based on your personal prejudices reflects poorly, not just on you, but on the entire special operations community. Rodriguez finally spoke up, his voice tight with embarrassment. Ma'am, on behalf of our team, I want to apologize for Petty Officer Morrison's behavior. His comments don't represent the views of our unit or the SEAL community as a whole. Sarah nodded graciously at Rodriguez. I appreciate that, Staff Sergeant. I know that the vast majority of Special Operations personnel understand the importance of mutual respect and professional conduct. Morrison finally found his voice, though it was barely above a whisper. Ma'am, I want to apologize. You're absolutely right. I was out of line, and I'm sorry. Apology accepted, Sarah replied. But more importantly, I hope you'll remember this conversation the next time you're tempted to judge someone based on assumptions rather than facts. Morrison nodded vigorously. Yes, ma'am, I will. Sarah's expression softened slightly as she prepared to conclude the interaction. The Special Operations community is small, Petty Officer Morrison. Our reputation depends on every member conducting themselves with professionalism and integrity. Your skills as a SEAL are valuable, but they're meaningless if you can't work effectively with other military personnel. "I understand, ma'am," Morrison replied, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Sarah glanced around the cafeteria one more time, taking in the faces of all the military personnel who had witnessed the exchange. All of us, regardless of rank or specialty, are part of the same team. We succeed or fail together. Never forget that. Quote, with that, Sarah returned to her table and calmly resumed eating her lunch. As if nothing unusual had happened, the dramatic confrontation was over. But its effects continued to ripple through the cafeteria. Morrison's teammates engaged him in quiet but intense conversation, clearly discussing the implications of what had just transpired. Other diners gradually returned to their own meals and conversations, though many continued to glance in Sarah's direction with obvious respect. Word of the incident spread quickly through the base, as military gossip always does. By evening, most personnel had heard some version of the story about the SEAL who had challenged a DevGru operator without realizing who she was. The tale grew in the telling, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Assumptions about military capability based on appearance or gender were both wrong and dangerous. Morrison spent the rest of his time at the base maintaining a much lower profile. His teammates made sure he understood that his behavior had violated the professional standards expected of special operations personnel. The incident became a teaching moment for the entire unit about the importance of respecting all service members regardless of their background. For Sarah, the confrontation was simply another example of the challenges faced by women in military service, particularly in combat roles. She had learned to handle such situations with grace and professionalism, understanding that her response would be judged not just on its immediate effectiveness, but on how it reflected on all women serving in similar positions. The story of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez became legendary within the special operations community, passed down as an example of how quiet competence and professional dignity could triumph over ignorance and prejudice. It served as a reminder that the military's strength came not from any single individual or unit, but from the collective dedication and sacrifice of all who served. Years later, Morrison would tell the story himself, usually as a cautionary tale about the danger of making assumptions. He eventually became a respected leader within his own right, but he never forgot the lesson he learned that day in the naval base cafeteria. That true warriors come in many forms, and the most dangerous mistake a soldier can make is underestimating the person standing next to them.